The night was heavy with humidity as the plane descended into the Savannah air. A thick, oppressive heat wrapped around Agent Marcus Avery the moment he stepped onto the tarmac. Even though it was well past midnight, the air felt alive, buzzing with the whispers of the past. Marcus had received the call only hours ago, a sudden assignment from the secret government paranormal investigation team he worked with. This wasn't his usual gig. Typically, his cases involved backwoods cabins or abandoned factories, not bustling, picturesque southern cities. But this one was different. The Marshall House had a history, one steeped in blood, war, and death. Built in 1851, the hotel stood like a silent sentinel over the city. Its grand facade, adorned with intricate wrought iron balconies, held secrets darker than the night. The Civil War had turned the hotel into a makeshift hospital for soldiers, many of whom had met their end within its walls. Years later, during the yellow fever outbreaks, it had once again been converted to care for the sick, its floors soaked with disease and death. Marcus had heard rumors of hauntings before, but this case was unlike any he had encountered. Guests at the Marshall House had reported more than just the usual bumps in the night. There were disappearances, attacks, and sightings of things that couldn't possibly be human. Crawlers, skinwalkers, shadow figures, and something far more sinister lurking in the shadows. As Marcus approached the Grand Hotel, its imposing presence made him feel small. The soft glow from its windows seemed to mock him, inviting him into a nightmare he wasn't sure he could survive. He clenched his jaw as he passed through the revolving doors, immediately greeted by the cold air inside. Unnatural, considering the stifling warmth just outside. "Welcome to the Marshall House, Mr. Avery," said the receptionist, her voice too calm for what Marcus knew awaited him. She didn't even look up, her fingers tapping lazily at the desk. "Strange night, isn't it?" Marcus replied, trying to feel out her reaction. She paused, her fingers halting. Slowly, she lifted her head, her eyes dark and hollow. "You have no idea." Marcus left the lobby, ascending the grand staircase with its dark wooden railings that creaked with age. As he passed portraits of the hotel's founders and old photographs of its Civil War hospital days, he felt a creeping unease wash over him. The walls seemed to hum with energy, the kind that came from years of suffering, pain, and death. The room he'd been assigned was on the 3rd floor. Ironically, the same floor where the worst of the yellow fever outbreaks had occurred. He opened the door, bracing himself for what was inside. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. A large 4-poster bed dominated the room, draped in heavy crimson curtains. An old-fashioned wardrobe stood in the corner, and a small writing desk was positioned near the window. But there was something else, a chill in the air, colder than it should have been, colder than the lobby had felt. It clung to his skin, seeping into his bones. Marcus dropped his bag on the bed and moved toward the window, glancing down at the street below. Fog rolled in from the river, thick and unnatural. Savannah was known for its eerie weather, but this felt wrong. A sharp knock on the door made him jump. He turned, heart pounding, and opened it. No one was there. The hallway stretched out before him, empty and quiet. But as he stepped out to look around, he felt it. Something was watching him. The faintest sound, like a dragging of feet on wood, echoed down the corridor. Slowly, he turned his gaze toward the end of the hall, where shadows seemed to pool unnaturally in the corner. And then a figure, dark, hunched, and impossibly tall. It moved in short, jerking motions as if its bones were bent at unnatural angles. Marcus's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped into the light. Its eyes gleamed, red and hungry. Marcus blinked, and it was gone. Sleep eluded Marcus that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt the presence of something just beyond his consciousness, watching, waiting. It wasn't until the first light of dawn crept through the cracks in the curtains that he finally gave up. He dressed quickly, strapping on his gear, a series of high-tech gadgets designed for ghost hunting and paranormal investigation. The government spared no expense when it came to equipment, though it didn't make the job any easier. It just helped them measure what they couldn't see. As he made his way down to the lobby, the receptionist from the night before was gone, replaced by an elderly man who greeted him with a silent nod. Marcus felt the eyes of the other guests on him as he passed through, their gazes filled with unease. They knew something was wrong here. Everyone did. Marcus's first stop was the basement. During the Civil War, it had served as the morgue. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried, and the makeshift hospital was overwhelmed with the dead. Some said the spirits of the soldiers still lingered, waiting for peace that would never come. The air grew thick and cold as he descended the narrow staircase. His flashlight cut through the darkness, revealing cobwebs and forgotten remnants of the past. Old stretchers lined the walls, rusted tools scattered across dusty tables. Suddenly, his equipment beeped, the temperature gauge dropping rapidly. Something was down here. A soft whisper echoed through the basement, barely audible but unmistakable. Marcus turned, his heart racing. A figure stood in the corner, faint, translucent, the shape of a man in tattered military uniform, staring at him with hollow eyes. Marcus approached cautiously, his hand gripping his EMF meter tightly. But before he could reach the spirit, it vanished, dissipating into the air like smoke. But something else remained. A low growl, deep and guttural, reverberated through the walls. The growl reverberated through the basement, its menacing sound sending a chill down Marcus's spine. He'd faced apparitions before, but this was something else, something darker. The coldness around him intensified, and the air felt thick, oppressive, like the weight of history itself was pressing down on his chest. His flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows across the stone walls. Each shadow seemed to writhe, growing darker and longer, distorting into grotesque shapes that made Marcus question whether he was seeing things. He took a slow step forward, feeling his breath catch as the growl returned. Closer this time, louder. Something was with him in the basement. The EMF reader in his hand spiked, the green light flickering violently before turning blood red. He cursed under his breath. The device barely had time to register the anomaly before it was yanked out of his hand by an unseen force. It skidded across the stone floor, disappearing into the darkness. Marcus spun around, his back pressed against the cold, damp wall. His eyes scanned the room, searching for the source of the growl. In the far corner, near an old hospital stretcher, something began to materialize. At first, it was nothing more than a shimmer in the air. But then the shimmer grew more defined, twisted. It was human, or at least it had been. The figure was gaunt, its skin stretched tight over bones, like an emaciated corpse brought back to life. Its eyes were hollow black pits, and its mouth hung open, revealing rows of jagged, rotten teeth. Its limbs were too long, its arms bending in unnatural angles as it crouched near the ground. Marcus's heart raced, his instincts screaming at him to run. But he couldn't. His feet felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The figure rose slowly, its head tilting to one side as if studying him, deciding whether he was prey. "Help me!" The words were barely a whisper, rasping out from the figure's twisted mouth. But as the words left its lips, the thing grinned, wide and horrific. It wasn't asking for help, it was mocking him. Without warning, the creature lunged. Marcus dove to the side, barely missing its grasp. He hit the ground hard, the air knocked out of his lungs. The figure skittered across the floor on all fours, moving with the unsettling speed and agility of a predator. It was close, too close. He scrambled to his feet, reaching for his salt rounds. As he fumbled with his gear, the creature lunged again, its skeletal fingers grazing his arm. The cold that followed the touch was unbearable, seeping into his skin like ice. With a desperate shout, Marcus fired the salt round, hitting the creature square in the chest. It screamed, a high-pitched, agonized wail that echoed through the basement, shaking the very walls. The figure convulsed, its body twisting and writhing before it disintegrated into ash, leaving nothing but a dark, charred stain on the floor. Marcus stood panting, his heart pounding in his chest. He glanced at the spot where the creature had vanished, his mind racing. This wasn't just some lost soul or ghost. This was something far more malevolent. Something old. The Marshall house had secrets. Secrets it had buried deep, beneath layers of history, death, and darkness. Marcus wasn't sure how long he stood there, staring at the place where the creature had disappeared. The basement felt unnervingly quiet now, but the eerie stillness was worse than the growls and the attacks. It felt like the calm before the storm. He shook himself back to reality and grabbed his gear. His arm ached where the creature had touched him, but he pushed the pain aside. There was more to this than just restless spirits. He needed answers, and fast. Back upstairs, the atmosphere of the hotel had shifted. The grand lobby, which had felt inviting the night before, now seemed darker, as though the shadows clung to the corners of the room like waiting predators. Even the antique chandelier hanging from the ceiling flickered, casting strange shapes across the floor. The receptionist, the elderly man who had nodded at him earlier, was gone. In his place was a young woman, her face pale, her eyes wide with unease. "Is everything all right?" Marcus asked, trying to sound casual, but he could feel the tension in his own voice. She shook her head, biting her lip. "No, it's not. Things are getting worse." Before he could ask what she meant, there was a loud crash from upstairs, a window shattering, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps running through the hallway. Marcus drew his gun, rushing toward the stairs. As he reached the second floor, he saw a trail of broken glass and splintered wood. A figure stood at the end of the hallway, staring at the shattered window. Marcus called out, "Hey, you can't be up here." The figure turned slowly. It was a man, dressed in a tattered Civil War uniform, his face gaunt and sunken. Blood dripped from his eyes and nose, pooling at his feet. His mouth opened, but no words came out, only a low, guttural moan. Marcus froze, watching in horror as more figures began to emerge from the walls. Soldiers, their bodies twisted and broken, their eyes empty sockets. They shuffled forward, dragging their mangled limbs behind them. Suddenly, the temperature dropped, and the lights flickered violently. The air was thick with the smell of decay. One of the figures let out a blood-curdling scream, its head snapping unnaturally to the side. Then, all at once, they charged. Marcus barely had time to react. He fired off a few rounds of salt, but it did little to slow them down. These weren't ordinary spirits. They were something worse, trapped in a violent death loop, driven by rage and agony. He turned and ran, but as he reached the stairwell, he stopped cold. Standing at the bottom of the stairs was the shadow figure from before, its red eyes gleaming in the darkness. The shadow figure at the bottom of the stairwell didn't move. Its glowing red eyes were locked on Marcus, and the chill in the air became unbearable. His skin prickled as the temperature dropped, breath visible in the cold. He backed away slowly, heart pounding in his chest. But before he could retreat further, the walls around him began to hum. At first, it was a low vibration, subtle, almost imperceptible. Then it grew, becoming a buzzing noise that filled the entire space, like 1,000 whispers overlapping. The voices were unintelligible, but there was a sinister rhythm to them, like a chant. Marcus turned, scanning the walls, but there was nothing, just the eerie sound of disembodied voices. The soldiers had vanished, leaving the hallway eerily silent except for the incessant hum. Marcus felt the weight of their absence more than their presence. It was as if something worse was coming, lurking just beyond the walls. Suddenly, the buzzing grew louder, a high-pitched screech that made his ears ring. The lights flickered overhead, casting long, distorted shadows that seemed to crawl up the walls like living things. Marcus winced in pain, covering his ears as the noise became unbearable. He stumbled down the hallway, desperate to escape the sound. The walls seemed to pulse, throbbing as though they were alive. As Marcus pressed his hand to the wall for balance, he felt something move beneath his palm. He recoiled in horror, watching as the plaster seemed to ripple, distorting the surface like a disturbed pond. Faces began to push through the walls, their mouths open in silent screams, their eyes wide with terror. They were trapped, prisoners of the house. Marcus backed away, his heart racing. The faces twisted in agony, their expressions frozen in torment. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were watching him, pleading for help, but there was nothing he could do. These were the spirits of the past, victims of the horrors that had unfolded in the Marshall house. As he reached the end of the hallway, the shadow figure at the bottom of the stairs finally moved. It raised one long, skeletal arm and pointed at him, its red eyes glowing brighter. Marcus felt an overwhelming wave of dread wash over him. It wasn't just a warning, it was a threat. The walls groaned, and the faces began to wail, their cries echoing in the confined space. Marcus turned and ran, but the sound followed him, growing louder with each step. The lights flickered one last time before plunging the entire hallway into complete darkness. He felt a hand brush against his back, cold and clammy. He whipped around, but there was nothing, just the suffocating darkness. The voices in the walls whispered again, closer now, like they were right next to him. A soft laugh echoed through the void. Marcus's blood ran cold. Marcus reached the grand lobby, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The darkness seemed to retreat slightly, but not entirely. The chandelier still flickered, casting faint, ghostly light across the room. He stumbled to the reception desk, searching for anything. Anything that could explain what was happening. But the young receptionist was gone. Panic settled in his chest. He had no backup, no clear plan. It was just him and whatever malevolent force was controlling the Marshall house. Suddenly, the old grandfather clock in the corner struck midnight. Its chime echoed through the empty lobby, a slow, ominous sound that made Marcus shiver. He glanced at the clock. Its hands weren't moving. It was stuck, frozen at 12. That's when he heard the dragging footsteps. They were faint at first, coming from the direction of the dining room, but they grew louder, closer, until Marcus could make out the distinct shuffle of something heavy being dragged across the floor. His pulse quickened, and he reached for his flashlight, flicking it on as he edged toward the dining room doors. The room beyond was dimly lit, the long dining table draped in dusty white cloth, like it hadn't been used in decades. The smell of decay hung in the air, and the chandeliers overhead cast weak, flickering light. Marcus scanned the room, his flashlight revealing the remnants of a once grand space now frozen in time. But there, at the far end of the room, something moved. A figure stood by the fireplace, its back turned to him. It wore a long, tattered dress, its hair hanging in matted clumps down its back. The figure swayed gently, like it was humming to itself. Marcus felt his throat tighten as the temperature in the room plummeted. Who are you?" Marcus managed to choke out. The figure stopped swaying, its head tilting slightly as if it had just heard him. Slowly, it turned to face him. The woman's face was a horror, skin pale and sagging, eyes hollow and dark. Her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, lips cracked and bleeding. She let out a low, croaking laugh, the sound grating against Marcus's nerves. Then, in one swift motion, she lunged. Marcus barely had time to react. He ducked out of the way, her icy hand grazing his arm. The touch burned like frostbite, searing his skin. He stumbled backward, crashing into a chair as the woman skittered toward him on all fours, moving unnaturally fast. He scrambled to his feet, firing his salt rounds as she advanced. The bullets hit her, but she barely flinched. Her eyes locked onto his, and her twisted smile grew wider, more malevolent. Marcus had faced spirits before, but this was something far worse, something ancient and filled with malice. The Marshall house groaned as if it were alive, each creak of the floorboards sounding like an ancient secret begging to be told. Marcus limped through the lobby, the cold burn from the ghost woman's touch still searing his skin. His flashlight flickered as he reached the old reception desk, the faint glow barely cutting through the thick veil of darkness that clung to every corner. The silence was palpable, broken only by the steady thump of his heartbeat in his ears. Suddenly, there was a sound, faint but unmistakable. A soft scratching noise, like nails dragging along wood, came from beneath his feet. He froze, every nerve in his body on high alert. The sound grew louder, more insistent. Something or someone was beneath the floor. Slowly, Marcus knelt down and pressed his ear to the wooden floorboards. The scratching turned into a faint whisper, unintelligible, but filled with desperation. The air around him seemed to grow colder as the voice became clearer, like it was rising from the depths of the earth. "Help us!" The words sent a chill down Marcus's spine. His mind raced. He had heard about the tunnels beneath the Marshall house, long abandoned but once used during the Civil War. The hotel had been a makeshift hospital, and the dead were often moved through the underground passages to avoid frightening the living. Could it be possible? Could the spirits of those long-dead soldiers still be trapped down there? Before he could act, a loud crash echoed through the lobby. Marcus jumped to his feet, heart pounding. He spun around, shining his flashlight in the direction of the noise. The chandelier above him swayed violently, the crystals clinking together like an eerie wind chime. A door slammed open at the far end of the lobby. It was the entrance to the basement. Swallowing his fear, Marcus made his way toward the basement stairs, the oppressive feeling of dread growing with each step. The air smelled of damp earth and decay as he descended into the darkness, the walls narrowing around him. The temperature dropped further, his breath coming out in shaky white clouds. At the bottom of the stairs, the basement was a maze of tunnels, their walls lined with crumbling bricks and rotting wooden beams. Marcus's flashlight barely penetrated the inky blackness ahead, but he could feel eyes watching him from the shadows. The scratching noise started again, louder this time. He turned a corner and froze. In the middle of the tunnel, a group of shadowy figures stood huddled together, their backs turned to him. They were muttering to themselves, their voices blending together into a low, eerie chant. As Marcus approached, his blood ran cold. These weren't just spirits. They were something darker, more malevolent. One of the figures turned its head toward him, its eyes hollow and lifeless. It let out a guttural moan, the sound echoing off the walls like a death rattle. The others turned slowly, their faces twisted in agony, skin hanging off their bones like they had been rotting for centuries. Marcus backed away, the walls closing in around him as the spirits advanced. Their whispers filled the air, growing louder and more frantic. He had to get out, had to escape before they dragged him down into whatever nightmare lay beneath the Marshall house. But then the tunnel ahead collapsed, sealing him in. Panic surged through Marcus as the dust from the collapsed tunnel settled around him. His exit was gone. He was trapped in the bowels of the Marshall house with the restless dead. He glanced over his shoulder, but the ghostly figures had disappeared. The tunnel was empty, save for the soft whispers echoing off the walls. But something was wrong. The air felt thicker, heavier, like the house itself was watching him. Marcus pressed forward, his flashlight flickering again as he moved deeper into the tunnels. The sound of his footsteps echoed in the narrow space, but there was something else, another set of footsteps, following close behind. He quickened his pace, the tunnel winding like a labyrinth around him. The walls seemed to shift, growing longer with each turn, as if the house was warping the space around him. His breathing became ragged, the air cold and thin. No matter how far he walked, he couldn't find his way out. Every turn led him deeper into the maze. Suddenly, the footsteps behind him stopped. Marcus froze, listening intently. The silence was oppressive, wrapping around him like a shroud. Then, without warning, a voice whispered in his ear, "You can't leave." He spun around, flashlight flaring to life as he aimed it at the tunnel behind him. There was nothing there, just the darkness stretching endlessly in both directions. But the voice remained, circling him like a predator. "You're one of us now." Panic gripped Marcus's chest as the temperature dropped further, frost creeping along the walls. The whispering voices returned, louder now, filling his head with their frantic pleas. Faces appeared in the walls, twisted and distorted like before, their eyes wide with terror. But this time they weren't just watching, they were reaching for him. Bony hands broke through the brick, clawing at the air around him, their fingers icy cold. Marcus backed away, his heart hammering in his chest. The tunnel began to tremble, dust and debris falling from the ceiling as the walls closed in. The ghostly figures trying to pull him into their prison. He stumbled backward, tripping over something in the darkness. His flashlight fell from his hand, spinning across the floor before landing against something solid. Marcus scrambled to grab it, but his hand touched something wet and cold. He looked down and saw the face of a man, half buried in the dirt, his eyes wide and lifeless. It was one of the rescue team members. Marcus recoiled in horror, but before he could move, the man's hand shot up and grabbed his wrist, his grip ice-cold and unyielding. Marcus fought to free himself from the icy grip of the corpse, his heart racing as terror coursed through his veins. The lifeless eyes of the rescue team member stared into his soul, as if begging for release. He pulled harder, desperate to escape, but the grip only tightened, dragging him closer to the dirt-covered face. "You can't leave!" the voice rasped, barely audible over the frantic beating of Marcus's heart. He felt a coldness creeping up his arm, numbing his body as the dead man's hand pulled him closer to the ground. In a desperate attempt to break free, Marcus grabbed a loose brick from the tunnel floor and smashed it against the man's wrist. There was a sickening crack, and the grip loosened just enough for him to break free. He stumbled backward, gasping for air, his body trembling from the cold and terror. The tunnel around him seemed to ripple, the walls pulsating as though the house itself was alive, feeding off his fear. The whispering voices grew louder, filling the air with their tormented cries. "Join us! You belong here!" Marcus grabbed his flashlight, the beam flickering weakly as he shone it around the tunnel. The faces in the walls seemed closer now, their eyes locked onto him with a hunger that chilled him to the bone. He needed to move, needed to find a way out before they claimed him as one of their own. He turned and ran, the tunnel stretching endlessly before him. Every step felt heavier, the weight of the spirits pulling him down, dragging him deeper into the abyss. The walls began to close in, narrowing until he could barely move. The air grew colder, more oppressive, as if the spirits were suffocating him. Suddenly, the tunnel opened up into a large, decaying hallway. It was lined with cracked mirrors, each one reflecting not Marcus, but the faces of the trapped souls who had died within the Marshall house. Their eyes followed his every move, their mouths twisted in silent screams. In the center of the hallway stood a figure, tall, shadowy, and ancient. It was the Shadow Man, the one who had been watching Marcus since the beginning. Its eyes were pits of darkness, and its smile was a cruel, twisted mockery of human expression. "You've seen too much," the Shadow Man hissed, its voice a low rumble that vibrated through Marcus's bones. "Now you belong to the house, just like the others." Marcus took a step back, his mind racing. He had to find a way to escape, but the hallway felt endless, and the Shadow Man was blocking his only exit. The walls trembled, the mirrors cracking as the spirits within them clawed at the glass, desperate to escape. "Run, Marcus," a voice whispered from the mirror beside him. It was familiar, comforting. He turned to see the reflection of one of his old team members, someone who had vanished during a previous mission. Their face was pale, gaunt, but their eyes still held a spark of life. "Run before it's too late," they urged, their voice filled with urgency. "He's coming for you." Without hesitation, Marcus turned and sprinted down the hallway, the Shadow Man's laughter echoing behind him. The walls seemed to close in, the floor beneath him shifting and cracking as though it were ready to swallow him whole. He had to keep moving, had to outrun the evil that lurked within the house. But deep down, Marcus knew. He was already running out of time. Marcus's footsteps echoed through the decaying hallways of the Marshall house, each step dragging him deeper into its dark heart. His body was heavy with exhaustion, and the oppressive cold seemed to seep into his bones. The whispering voices followed him, urging him to give up, to let the house consume him. But he couldn't. Not yet. Ahead of him, the hallway opened into a massive ballroom, the ornate walls now crumbling with decay. The once elegant chandeliers hung precariously from the ceiling, their crystals coated in thick layers of dust. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and death, and Marcus could feel the weight of countless souls pressing down on him. In the center of the room stood the Shadow Man, its form even more imposing in the vast, empty space. It loomed over a figure lying on the ground, one of the rescue team members, barely alive, their body covered in wounds that oozed with an unnatural black ichor. The Shadow Man turned its hollow eyes toward Marcus, its twisted grin widening. "You can't save them. No one leaves this place." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest. His flashlight flickered and died, plunging the room into near total darkness. The only light came from the faint glow of the moon, filtering in through the cracked windows. The atmosphere was suffocating, the air thick with malevolence. "I won't let you take me," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the fear gripping him. "I won't let you win." The Shadow Man's laughter filled the room, a deep, guttural sound that shook the very foundation of the house. "You're already mine, Marcus. You've been mine since you first stepped foot in this cursed place." Suddenly, the ballroom began to shake, the walls cracking as though the house itself was coming apart. The spirits trapped within the mirrors shattered free, their tormented cries filling the air. They swirled around Marcus like a whirlwind, their cold hands reaching for him, trying to drag him down into their eternal prison. But Marcus wasn't alone. The figure on the ground stirred, weak but determined. It was the last member of the rescue team, clinging to life. "We have to destroy the source," they whispered, their voice barely audible over the chaos. "It's the house. The house is the source of its power." Marcus nodded, his mind racing. The house, of course. The Marshall house had been feeding on the souls of the dead for centuries, trapping them in its walls, turning them into something dark and twisted. But how could he destroy a place so ancient, so filled with malevolent energy? The ground beneath him cracked, and a deep, rumbling growl echoed from below. The Shadow Man lunged at him, its form shifting and stretching, becoming more monstrous with each passing second. Marcus dodged, barely avoiding its grasp. In that moment, he saw it, a single beam of moonlight illuminating a spot in the center of the ballroom. It was faint, but there was something there, buried beneath the floorboards. Something old, something powerful. With all his strength, Marcus ran toward the spot, grabbing a broken chair leg as a makeshift weapon. He smashed through the floorboards, revealing a small, ancient chest. The moment he touched it, the house screamed, a terrible, inhuman sound that rattled his bones. The Shadow Man howled in rage, its form flickering and distorting. Marcus didn't hesitate. He raised the chair leg and brought it down on the chest with all his might. The chest shattered, and with it, the house itself began to collapse. The walls crumbled. The spirits screamed as they were released from their torment, and the Shadow Man's form disintegrated into nothingness. Marcus collapsed to the ground, breathing heavily, as the world around him faded into darkness. Finally, the curse of the Marshall house was broken.